Sophie tugged the sled harder, each scrape of wood over gravel echoing her determination. Dust coated the horizon, turning the ordinary road into a river of amber. Eleanor struggled beside her, a thin breath between heartbeats, hand clutching the small bottle of medicine that might keep her alive a little longer. Life had been unkind, yet somehow the day demanded they keep moving. Then the growl came, a sound both low and terrifying. At first, Sophie froze, small and fragile against the rising tension of a stranger waiting in the shadows. But the dog that emerged was no ordinary stranger. Valor, though she didn't know his name yet, carried the strength of someone who had served, someone who had loved, and someone who had been left behind. His eyes met hers, and in that instant, Sophie understood something even her young mind could grasp. This wasn't just chance. This was fate, a silent promise, and perhaps a second chance for a little girl to learn the meaning of courage, love, and loyalty in the fur of a dog. The storm had rolled in just after sundown, a prairie storm that rattled the windows and threw down sheets of rain against the tin rooftops of Red Willow. Lightning forked across the Nebraska sky, illuminating the streets for brief, startling moments before plunging them back into darkness. Inside the small veterinary clinic, the fluorescent lights hummed quietly, their sterile glow a fragile barrier against the violence of the weather outside. Dr. Amelia Rhodes, hunched over a stack of patient files, barely noticed the thunder. She was tired, her long auburn hair pulled into a messy knot, her white coat speckled with the faint scent of antiseptic and animal fur. Nights in Red Willow were usually uneventful. An aging farm dog with arthritis, a cat with a hairball, maybe the occasional calf delivered in the backlot by flashlight. But this night was different. The clinic door slammed open, carried inward by a gust of rain and wind, and Amelia's pen slipped from her fingers. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to freeze. Framed in the doorway was a child, drenched and trembling, her blonde pigtails plastered against her muddy cheeks. Sophie Grace Carter, 6 years old, thin as a reed, dressed in a tattered pink princess gown that now clung to her like rags. And behind her, scraping across the tile floor, was a makeshift sled, cobbled together from splintered wood and rope. Upon it lay a German shepherd, massive, blood-soaked, and unmoving, except for the faint rise and fall of his ribcage. Gasps echoed through the clinic. A nurse dropped her clipboard. Someone whispered, "Dear Lord." The dog's ragged breathing filled the silence, every wheeze like a countdown, ticking closer to death. Sophie's small hands were raw, the skin torn and blistered from gripping rope through miles of gravel and mud. Her lips quivered, but her chin remained defiantly lifted. The determination in her eyes far too old for a child's face, held the room captive. She staggered forward one step, then another, her voice breaking as she tried to form words. "Please," she whispered, her throat cracked with exhaustion. "Please, help him." The dog's head shifted, just slightly, as if in answer to her plea. His amber eyes opened, dulled by pain, but carrying a strange dignity, a soldier's refusal to surrender. Amelia's own heart clenched. How had this little girl, no bigger than a sack of grain, managed to haul 80 pounds of dying animal through a storm? She dropped to her knees beside the sled, stethoscope already in hand. "Clear a table," she barked to the staff. The urgency in her voice jolted everyone into motion. The reception counter became a battlefield, assistants rushing to lay out gauze, IV kits, antibiotics. But Amelia couldn't stop glancing at Sophie. The child swayed on her feet, her tiny fist still clamped around the rope handles as if letting go meant giving up. And she wasn't about to give up. "Sweetheart," Amelia said softly, reaching to steady her. How far did you bring him? Sophie's lips trembled again. From the creek. Grandma tried to carry him, but her breath hitched. I promised Daddy I'd take care of him. The words sliced through Amelia like lightning. Daddy, the father Sophie barely remembered, the one Red Willow had buried 3 years ago after a police ambush left Officer Daniel Carter dead. For a moment, Amelia's hands faltered. She had treated Valor before, back when Daniel would bring him in for routine checkups. That proud, disciplined German shepherd was lying before her now, broken and gasping. How had he survived all this time? Where had he been hiding? A nurse touched Amelia's shoulder, snapping her back. The dog's pulse was weak, the leg mangled, infection already crawling through his system. But there was fight in him still. And in the eyes of the little girl who refused to let go of the rope, there was something fiercer than fight. There was love. All right, Amelia said firmly. We're not losing him tonight. The clinic erupted in coordinated chaos, IV lines sliding into vein, fluids dripping steadily, antiseptic stinging as it hit torn flesh. The storm outside roared, thunder shaking the windows. But inside, the battle narrowed to one child's desperate plea and one dog's stubborn heartbeat. As Sophie collapsed into a chair, trembling, Eleanor Carter finally burst through the doors, soaked to the bone, her chest heaving with the effort of catching up. She clutched her heart, the pill bottle rattling faintly in her pocket, her eyes wide at the sight of Valor on the table. "What have you done, Sophie?" Eleanor whispered, horror and awe mingling in her voice. But Sophie only looked up, tears streaking clean paths through the dirt on her cheeks. "I brought him home, Grandma. I couldn't leave him there." The storm cracked again, lightning spilling into the clinic windows, and for the first time that night, Amelia realized this was not just about saving a dog. This was about something far larger, something written in the fierce determination of a child too young to carry such burdens, and yet carrying them anyway. The dog on her table was no stray. He was history, loyalty, grief, and hope bound together. He was the bridge between a girl who had lost too much and a father whose love still lingered in fur and bone. And as the machines began to beep with steadier rhythms, Amelia's trembling hands steadied too. Whatever it took, this fight wasn't over. Doctor. Amelia Rhodes had treated countless animals in her 15 years at Red Willow Veterinary Clinic. Barn cats singed by machinery belts, hunting dogs mauled by barbed wire, calves born too early to stand. But never in all those years had she faced something quite like this. The sight of Sophie Grace Carter, a little girl in a mud-stained princess dress, her palms raw and bleeding, dragging a German shepherd, nearly her own weight through a storm, was something that would live with Amelia forever. She had expected shock, fear, perhaps a child breaking down after such an ordeal. But when Amelia leaned in close to the table where the dog now lay, she saw something else reflected in Sophie's blue-gray eyes. Fierce, unrelenting determination. The girl clutched the edge of the stainless steel table as though bracing herself against the inevitable. Her small frame shook with exhaustion, yet her voice came steady, almost pleading, but without surrender. "Please," she whispered, leaning close to Valor's torn ear. Then she turned her gaze to Amelia, eyes bright, despite the tears streaking her cheeks. "Please, he's my friend. He needs you." The words caught Amelia off guard. Friend. Not pet. Not dog. Not even rescue. Friend. She looked down at the shepherd. The animal's chest rose shallowly, every breath a rattle of defiance. Blood matted his coat, his back leg swollen around the cruel bite of steel. His gums were pale, his dehydration evident. But his eyes were alive, amber, steady, and unbearably human in their resilience. Amelia swallowed hard. She had seen animals give up before, their gaze turning inward, surrendering to the silence of death. This one had not. "Get me another IV line," she ordered, her voice sharper than she intended. The nurse hustled to comply. "And warm fluids, now." The room buzzed into action, but Sophie stayed rooted at Valor's side. She pressed her palm against his muzzle, whispering words Amelia couldn't quite catch. Fragments floated in the air. "Brave. Stay. Daddy would want." The child's voice trembled like a prayer, but the dog's breathing seemed to steady at the sound, as though the sheer force of her faith tethered him to life. "How far did you carry him?" Amelia asked, trying to calculate shock levels. Sophie didn't answer right away. She was stroking Valor's fur, her fingers moving gently over the crusted blood, as though afraid to hurt him further. At last, without looking up, she murmured, "From Miller's Creek, all the way. Grandma tried, but she's sick, so I pulled him myself." "Miller's Creek?" Amelia's head jerked up. That was nearly 13 miles from town. The nurses exchanged incredulous glances, one of them muttering, "No way." Amelia crouched so her eyes met Sophie's. "Honey, you're telling me you dragged him that far? In this storm?" Sophie finally looked at her, exhaustion swimming in her gaze, but layered with something harder, something that made Amelia's chest tighten. "I had to," she said simply. "He was waiting for someone. If I left him, he would die. I promised I wouldn't leave." Her voice cracked on the last word, but her chin lifted stubbornly, like a soldier refusing to cry on the battlefield. Amelia felt the burn of tears behind her own eyes. She reached for Sophie's raw, rope-burned hand, surprised when the girl flinched. The skin was torn, blistered, the kind of injury that would scar. The child must have been in agony for miles, yet she hadn't stopped. "You did the impossible," Amelia whispered. "Now it's our turn." She squeezed Sophie's hand, then turned back to Valor, steeling herself. His vitals were unstable, but not hopeless. A dog who had made it this far, with injuries this severe, had reserves of strength most humans couldn't fathom. As Amelia worked, Sophie refused to step back. She stood so close her breath fogged the steel table. When Amelia cleaned the wound, Sophie murmured encouragement. When the IV needle slid in, Sophie stroked Valor's head until his tension eased. The dog's ears twitched faintly, one eye opening to track Sophie's face. It wasn't gratitude Amelia saw, it was recognition. As though Valor had chosen her, bound to her by something neither infection nor distance could break. "Doc," one nurse whispered nervously, "this dog shouldn't still be alive. Look at that leg. Look at the infection." "He's alive because he's fighting." Amelia cut her off, her tone sharp. "And because she nodded towards Sophie, refused to give up." The nurse fell silent, chastened. Lightning cracked outside, rattling the windows. In that brief flash, Amelia caught the full picture. A mud-smeared child, barely more than a toddler, standing guard over a broken warrior. Innocence and tragedy bound together, neither willing to let go. Something stirred in Amelia's chest. It wasn't just medicine that would keep this shepherd alive. It was this child's belief, raw and unshakable. "All right, Valor," Amelia murmured under her breath, speaking to the dog as though he were an old comrade. "Show us what you've got left." The dog's amber eyes flickered once, and his chest rose with a deeper, steadier breath. It was faint, but it was there. The mysterious resilience of a creature who had carried burdens humans rarely understood. Sophie smiled through her tears, pressing her forehead gently to his. "See? "He heard you," she whispered. "He wants to stay. He just needed someone to tell him." For one suspended moment, the storm outside faded, and all Amelia could hear was the fragile rhythm of a heartbeat refusing to quit. 3 hours earlier, the Carter farmhouse sat weathered and weary at the edge of Red Willow's fields, its white paint flaking into gray, its porch sagging as if under the same weight that pressed against the shoulders of the woman who lived inside. The storm had not yet broken, but the air carried that heavy stillness, a silence before thunder that made even the curtains feel restless. At the kitchen table, beneath a single bulb that buzzed faintly, Eleanor Carter leaned over a mason jar, her arthritic fingers sorting through a small pile of wrinkled bills and coins. She counted once, then again, lips moving without sound, as though repeating the numbers might make them grow. 17, 18. Her voice cracked into the emptiness. She tucked the money back into the jar marked Sophie's college fund with a shaky sigh. The jar looked pitiful on the table, almost mocking in its smallness. For years she had fed coins into it, scraping from grocery change, setting aside dollars when she could. But now, with the foreclosure notice pinned beside her coffee cup, the jar was a cruel reminder of promises she might never keep. The notice bore a date like a ticking clock. 30 days. 30 days before the farm that had belonged to her husband, her parents, and her grandparents would be stripped away. At 71, Eleanor had little strength left to fight banks. She had already buried Harold, then her only son Daniel after the ambush. And now she was raising Daniel's daughter with nothing but stubborn faith and a heart that sometimes betrayed her with its stuttering beats. Her hand hovered over her pill bottle. She shook one tablet into her palm, dry swallowed, and pressed her lips together until the dizziness eased. From the back of the house, a child's laughter floated faintly through the open window. Sophie's laughter, high and unrestrained, the kind that refused to acknowledge foreclosure notices or empty jars. Eleanor closed her eyes, clinging to that sound. It was the only music left in this farmhouse. "Sophie Grace?" she called, her voice carrying across the wooden floors. "Breakfast's on the table, honey." No answer. Just the faint thump of small feet in the yard. Eleanor rose with effort, joints creaking like the house itself. She stepped onto the porch. The fields stretched wide and gold under the afternoon sun, stalks of corn swaying gently in the breeze. Beyond the fence line, wild vines clung stubbornly to posts, as though refusing to let go of land that no longer wanted them. "Sophie?" she tried again. Her eyes found the child near the old oak, barefoot, her princess dress already smudged with dirt. Sophie knelt in the grass, arranging broken twigs into neat rows, her blonde pigtails bouncing with each movement. To anyone else, it was a child's idle game. To Eleanor, it was the very essence of her granddaughter, restless, inventive, building something out of nothing. "Come in and eat before it gets cold," Eleanor called. But Sophie didn't move. Instead, she lifted her head suddenly, eyes fixed toward the distant creek bed. A sound drifted faintly on the wind, high-pitched, desperate, not human. Eleanor felt her pulse skip. It was the kind of sound that sent a chill into the bones, the kind that mothers and grandmothers knew meant pain. Sophie's small face tightened. "Grandma, did you hear that?" Eleanor hesitated, hand braced on the porch rail. For a moment, she wanted to pretend she hadn't, wanted to draw her granddaughter inside and shut the door against whatever waited out there. The farm, the bank, her health. She had enough battles. She didn't need another. But Sophie was already on her feet, moving toward the fence line with that same Carter stubbornness her father once carried like armor. "Sophie Grace Carter," You stop right there." Eleanor's voice cracked like a whip. The girl froze, turned, her eyes wide, but burning with something older than 6 years should carry. "It's someone hurt, Grandma. I know it." Eleanor shook her head. "Could be a coyote. Could be a wild dog. You don't go near things you don't understand." Sophie's small hands clenched into fists. "Daddy would have helped." The words struck Eleanor harder than thunder ever could. Daniel's voice, Daniel's heart, coming out of this child who barely remembered him. She pressed a hand against her chest, torn between fear and pride. She looked back at the kitchen table through the open door. The foreclosure notice, the empty breakfast bowls, the jar with its pitiful $18, all symbols of loss. And then she looked at Sophie, barefoot, dirt-streaked, fearless, and saw the future fighting not to be swallowed. With a weary sigh, Eleanor stepped off the porch. "All right, but you stay behind me. Do you hear?" Sophie's smile flashed, bright, fierce, unafraid. Together, they walked across the field toward the creek bed, the sound of desperate whimpering guiding them through the tall grass. With every step, Eleanor's heart pounded harder, not just from exertion, but from the dread that whatever waited would change their lives forever. And it would. The old creek bed cut through the Carter farmland like a scar, a dry gash left behind after a summer of too little rain. Once, Daniel had caught frogs there as a boy, his laughter echoing through the trees while Eleanor scolded him for coming home with mud up to his knees. Now it lay barren, only cracked stones and tangled brush where water had once run. Eleanor Carter moved as quickly as her joints would allow, breath shallow, heart pounding with each step. Sophie's cry had carried across the fields, thin but sharp enough to slice through her chest like a blade. She pushed aside brambles and elderberry bushes, the thorns snagging her worn sweater. "Sophie Grace?" she called again, panic edging her voice. No answer. Only that same sound she'd heard from the porch, high-pitched and raw with pain. Then she saw her. Kneeling in the dust at the bottom of the dry creek bed, Sophie looked impossibly small, her princess dress streaked with mud, her blonde hair tangled and wild. Both of her hands worked furiously at something half hidden among the rocks. Eleanor stumbled closer, her eyes focusing, and her breath caught. A German shepherd lay sprawled in the dirt, his hind leg caught in the steel jaws of an illegal trap. The cruel metal teeth had bitten deep, the fur matted with blood that had dried black around the wound. The great dog's chest rose in shallow, uneven breaths. His ears twitched weakly at Eleanor's approach, but his body remained still, too exhausted to fight. And there was Sophie, her small fingers slick with blood, not all her own, pulling at the trap's unforgiving mechanism, tears streaking through the dirt on her cheeks. "Grandma, help!" she sobbed, not even looking up. "He's stuck. He's dying." Eleanor's knees buckled, and she knelt beside her granddaughter, the ground biting into her bones. "Oh, Lord, have mercy." The shepherd turned his head, amber eyes lifting to meet hers. And in those eyes, Eleanor saw not the wild fear of an animal cornered, but something achingly familiar, intelligence, despair, and a quiet, hopeless dignity. It was the look of a soldier who had fought too long, who had been abandoned to die. For a heartbeat, Eleanor froze. Her instinct screamed danger, wild animal, powerful jaws, disease. But her heart whispered something else. This dog wasn't wild. He had been loved once. She could see it in the way his coat, beneath the dirt and blood, still carried the faint sheen of care. Sophie pressed harder against the trap, her little face contorted with effort. The sharp edge nicked her palm, and she gasped in pain, but she didn't stop. Blood welled along her fingers. "Stop, Sophie!" Eleanor grabbed her wrists, pulling her back. "You'll hurt yourself." Sophie wrenched free with surprising strength. "I don't care. He needs me." Her voice rang through the empty creek bed, fierce and trembling. She pressed both tiny hands against the shepherd's head, whispering through her tears. "It's okay, boy. I won't leave you. Daddy wouldn't leave you either." The shepherd's eyes closed briefly at her touch, and his massive body shuddered with a sound that was almost a sigh. He leaned just faintly into her hand. Eleanor's throat tightened. She had seen children cradle broken birds, kittens abandoned in barns, but never had she seen such raw devotion between a child and a creature most grown men would avoid. "Grandma," Sophie whispered, looking up at her with pleading eyes. "Please, he knows we're trying to help." Eleanor forced herself to look at the trap. The steel was rusted, old, the kind poachers still set, despite the law. The teeth had cut deep but hadn't shattered the bone, at least not visibly. Infection had set in, though. She could smell it beneath the copper tang of blood. If they didn't act soon, the dog wouldn't last the night. Her hands trembled. At her age, she wasn't strong enough for the springs anymore, but Sophie was right. The animal hadn't growled, hadn't snapped. He was watching them both, amber gaze flicking between grandmother and child, as if weighing whether to trust. "All right," Eleanor murmured, voice thick. "But you stay behind me, do you hear? If he lashes out, you run." Sophie nodded fiercely, though Eleanor doubted she would run from anything. Bracing her knees against the dirt, Eleanor pressed down on the trap's spring-loaded arms. Pain shot through her joints, fire along her knuckles, but she gritted her teeth and bore down harder. The mechanism groaned. "Now, Sophie, lift his leg. Careful, baby." Sophie's hand slid under Valor's mangled limb, so gentle it made Eleanor ache. With one last push, the trap's jaws snapped open. Sophie eased the leg free, and the shepherd let out a whimper that sounded startlingly like relief. Then, instead of bolting into the brush, the dog collapsed forward into the dust, his head dropping against Sophie's lap. She gasped softly, then smiled through her tears. "See, Grandma? He's not wild. He's good." Eleanor could only stare. The child's thin arms wrapped around the shepherd's massive shoulders, and the animal allowed it, leaned into it, even. He was too weak to stand, but not too far gone to understand he had been saved. The storm clouds above rumbled, and a cool wind swept through the dry creek bed, carrying with it the smell of rain and earth. Eleanor looked down at Sophie, dress torn, hands bloodied, face radiant with the fierce joy of a child who had refused to abandon the helpless. And in that moment, Eleanor knew. This wasn't just chance. This was something larger, heavier. A crossroads of past and future, grief and hope. The shepherd's amber eyes opened once more, locking with hers. In them, Eleanor thought she saw a flicker of memory, of something familiar buried deep. A soldier's gaze, her son's gaze, her breath caught. She didn't yet know the truth, but her heart whispered it anyway. This dog belongs to us. The creek bed had grown silent after the trap snapped open. Only the faint rasp of the German shepherd's breath and the distant rumble of thunder broke the stillness. Eleanor Carter sat back on her heels, her chest burning from the effort of forcing the trap open. Sweat stung her eyes despite the cool air. Her heart pounded, skipping irregular beats that reminded her she was no longer a woman who could wrestle with steel. The shepherd lay stretched across the dirt, his leg trembling, his great body heaving with exhaustion. Sophie cradled his head in her lap, as though he were nothing more than a wounded lamb, stroking the fur between his ears with bloodied fingers. Her small dress, once pink, once bright with childish dreams, was now smeared with mud and streaked crimson. Eleanor's hands shook as she wiped them on her skirt. She should have pulled Sophie away the moment she saw him, should have told her this wasn't their fight. She tried again, her voice sharp but cracked with fear. "Sophie Grace, that's a wild animal." The child didn't look up. Her gaze was fixed on the shepherd's amber eyes, which fluttered open and followed her movements with startling calm. "He's not wild, Grandma," Sophie said softly, though her voice carried a conviction that made Eleanor pause. "Look at his eyes." Eleanor forced herself to. She expected to see the feral flash of instinct, the dangerous spark of teeth barely contained. But what met her gaze was different. The shepherd's eyes, though clouded with pain, held something recognizably human: patience, weariness, and a quiet plea for mercy. Still, Eleanor shook her head, trying to bury the pull she felt in her chest. "Eyes don't change what he is. He's strong enough to kill you with one snap if he wanted." "But he doesn't want to," Sophie countered, voice breaking but firm. She pressed her palm against the shepherd's muzzle, unafraid. "He knows we want to help." Lightning flickered above them, casting the creek in silver light. Eleanor saw the girl's small frame bent over the massive dog, a picture of innocence wrapped around suffering, and it twisted something deep inside her. She thought of Daniel, her son in uniform, broad shoulders squared, kneeling once in this very field to tie a ribbon in Sophie's hair before he left for duty. Daniel had believed in protecting the weak, no matter the risk. And now his daughter, who had lost him to violence she would never fully understand, was living that same creed in the dirt and blood of a dry creek bed. Eleanor's throat tightened. "Child, you don't know the danger you're courting. You've already lost your daddy. I can't let you lose yourself too." Sophie's head snapped up, her face streaked with tears and grit, eyes fierce in a way that startled Eleanor. "That's why I can't leave him, Grandma. Because I know what it feels like to lose someone, and I won't let him be left alone." The words hung between them, heavy as thunder. Eleanor looked away, blinking hard. She had carried grief for years, burying her husband Harold, then Daniel, then the life she thought she'd have in her later years. Every loss had carved her smaller, quieter. But Sophie, this child carried the same grief and yet refused to bow to it. Instead of turning away, she reached for what was broken. The shepherd shifted faintly, his ears twitching at Sophie's voice. He didn't growl, didn't bare teeth. He simply pressed his muzzle deeper into the folds of her dress, as if finding safety there. Eleanor felt something in her chest crack. Not her weak heart this time, but the walls she had built to protect it. "Lord, help me," she murmured, her voice trembling. She sank down beside Sophie, close enough to feel the heat radiating from the dog's battered body. "Maybe you're right. Maybe he does know." Sophie's expression softened, though determination still shone in her eyes. She leaned down, whispering into the shepherd's ear, as though confiding secrets no one else could hear. Eleanor couldn't make out the words, but she saw the way the animal's breathing steadied under her touch. A gust of wind swept through the creek bed, rattling the brush, carrying with it the smell of approaching rain. Eleanor shivered. Something about this moment felt fated, larger than the three of them crouched in the dirt. Her gaze shifted back to Sophie. Blood streaked the child's hands, the rope burns raw and angry from earlier games that turned into rescue. Yet she looked unflinching. This was no ordinary stubbornness. This was faith, raw and unpolished, burning like a flame in the dark. "You're your father's girl, through and through," Eleanor whispered. Sophie tilted her head. "Daddy would have helped him, right?" "Yes," Eleanor admitted, tears welling despite herself. "Your daddy never could walk away from someone hurting. And neither, it seems, can you." For a long moment, neither spoke. They sat together in the dust, one hand of a grandmother resting on her granddaughter's shoulder, the other stroking the head of a dying German shepherd who had not yet given up. When the first drops of rain began to fall, cool against Eleanor's cheeks, she knew there would be no leaving him here. Not while Sophie still had strength in her small body, not while the dog still had life in his chest. Fear still gnawed at her, whispering of danger and loss, but Sophie's courage was louder, and Eleanor, tired, grieving, but still a Carter, chose to listen. The trap groaned under Eleanor's trembling grip, the rusted springs fighting against her failing strength. Her breath came in shallow bursts, heart hammering in her chest. For a moment she thought her body would betray her, that her arms would give way before she could finish. "Push harder, Grandma," Sophie urged, her small face streaked with dirt and rain. She had both hands beneath the shepherd's mangled leg, waiting, eyes wide with hope. Eleanor gritted her teeth. "On 3, 1, 2. The metal jaws snapped open with a screech that echoed through the dry creek bed. Sophie quickly lifted the heavy leg free, her fingers trembling as she eased it down into the dust. The shepherd let out a low, guttural whimper, half relief, half pain. His entire body shuddered as if decades of weight had just been lifted. Eleanor released the trap with a grunt, letting it slam shut again, empty this time. She sat back hard, chest burning, her palms raw from the effort. For a moment, all she could hear was the pounding of her own blood in her ears. "Grandma," Sophie whispered. Eleanor looked up. The dog hadn't run. He hadn't even tried. Instead, he lay where he had fallen, chest heaving, his head resting heavily against Sophie's lap. His amber eyes fluttered open just enough to fix on the child's face, and in that gaze was something Eleanor could not deny. Trust. She swallowed hard. Any wild animal would have bolted the instant the trap was released, limping into the brush to lick its wounds. But this one chose to stay. Chose the girl. Sophie stroked his muzzle with bloodied fingers, whispering words meant for him alone. "It's okay now, boy. You're safe. I've got you." The shepherd's ears twitched faintly, and his tail moved the smallest fraction. Not quite a wag, but not nothing either. Eleanor felt her throat tighten. Against every practical instinct she had, she believed the dog understood. Rain began to fall in earnest now, fat drops splattering against the dry stones, washing rivulets of red into the dirt. The storm would be upon them soon, and they couldn't stay here. Eleanor forced herself to her feet, ignoring the stabbing pain in her knees. "We can't leave him here, Grandma," Sophie said quickly, as though reading her thoughts. Her voice cracked, but her chin lifted stubbornly. Eleanor looked down at the massive body sprawled across the creek bed. "Child, he's near 80 pounds, maybe more. We can't carry him all the way to town." Sophie's eyes darted toward the trees, already calculating. "Daddy's wagon, in the barn. We can make a sled." Eleanor shook her head, rain dripping into her eyes. That wagon's older than you are. The wheels are split. The wood's rotted. But it'll work, Sophie interrupted, her tone fierce. It has to. Hurt things need doctors, Grandma. You always said that. The words struck Eleanor like a blow. She had said it years ago, when Sophie brought home a sparrow with a broken wing. Daniel had said it too, every time he left for a shift. Hurt things need help. And now his daughter threw those words back at her, a torch she refused to let go out. Eleanor pressed a trembling hand to her chest. The dog's ragged breathing filled the silence, and Sophie's wide eyes burned with that unshakable Carter determination. "All right," Eleanor whispered finally. "We'll try." Sophie's face lit with relief, and for a brief moment Eleanor saw Daniel in her expression. The same stubborn fire, the same reckless heart. Together, they worked in silence. Sophie tore strips from her own dress, wrapping them around the shepherd's wound with a tenderness far beyond her years. The pink fabric, once bright and childish, became a makeshift bandage, turning her play costume into something sacrificial. Eleanor watched, her chest aching. "You're giving up your favorite dress," Eleanor murmured. Sophie pressed the fabric firmly against the bleeding. "It's magic, Grandma. Daddy gave it to me. That means it'll keep him safe." Eleanor closed her eyes, blinking away tears. Faith like that could move mountains, or drag an 80-pound dog through a storm. And by the time they managed to coax the shepherd onto the old wagon, Eleanor's back screamed in protest. The wood groaned under the weight, nails squealing, but it held. Sophie tied the ropes around her shoulders, testing the knot with small, blistered hands. "You'll tear yourself apart," Eleanor warned, reaching for the rope. But Sophie shook her head. "I'm strong enough. He needs me." The rain intensified, turning the path slick with mud. Sophie leaned forward, straining against the rope. The cart lurched, wheels creaking, then rolled. Inch by inch, foot by foot, the impossible journey began. Eleanor walked beside them, one hand on the shepherd's flank, feeling the faint rise and fall of his ribs. She whispered a prayer under her breath, the words swallowed by the storm. Above them, thunder rolled. Ahead, miles of road waited. Behind them, the cruel trap sat empty in the dirt, rusting and harmless. And in the middle of it all, a child with nothing left but love, a grandmother torn between fear and faith, and a wounded dog who had chosen trust over flight. It was madness. It was impossible. But it had already begun. The storm had eased into a grey drizzle by the time Sophie looped the rope around her small shoulders, the wagon creaking under the weight of the wounded German shepherd. The road stretched long and empty before them, 8 miles of dust and gravel between the dry creek bed and Red Willow's main street. The makeshift sled groaned with every shift of the dog's body. His chest rose in shallow breaths, and the pink fabric of Sophie's torn dress clung to the wound at his leg, already soaked with blood and rain. She leaned forward, planting one bare foot in front of the other, her thin arms straining against the rope. The effort pulled her entire frame taut, and the rope bit deep into her blistered palms. Eleanor walked beside her, her cane forgotten at the creek, one hand pressed against the wagon's edge as though steadying both dog and child at once. The bottle of heart pills rattled faintly in her coat pocket with every step, a reminder of the fragility that stalked her. Her breath came uneven, and each incline along the road felt like a mountain. Yet she kept moving. The silence between them was broken only by the crunch of wagon wheels on gravel and Sophie's labored breaths. Eleanor looked down at her granddaughter, the little girl's face pale beneath smudges of dirt, lips trembling with effort. Any other child would have collapsed by now. But Sophie kept walking, her gaze fixed straight ahead, as if the town lights were already in sight. "Sweetheart, let me take the rope for a while," Eleanor urged, her voice breaking. Sophie shook her head, tightening her grip. "You're not strong enough, Grandma. You'll get sick." Her words were matter-of-fact, not cruel, spoken with the honesty of a child who had already seen too much. Eleanor felt tears sting her eyes. Once upon a time, she was the strong one, running the farm, raising Daniel, shouldering burdens without complaint. Now, it was this child, Daniel's child, who bore the weight. The shepherd stirred faintly, his eyes flickering open. His amber gaze found Sophie's small back as she dragged him onward, and for a moment his tail twitched against the wagon boards. Eleanor caught the movement and swallowed hard. It was as though he understood the sacrifice being made for him. The road wound past abandoned farmhouses, their windows dark, their fences sagging. Each ruin whispered of loss, of families who had given up when the land grew too hard, when the banks came calling. Eleanor felt the weight of that history pressing against her. She and Sophie were no different, hanging on by threads, waiting for the foreclosure to sweep them away like dust. And yet, here they were, a child in a torn dress dragging a half-dead dog through the mud, refusing to give up. It was madness. It was impossible. And it was the only thing keeping them moving. The rope slipped suddenly, burning Sophie's palms. She stumbled, fell to her knees. Eleanor's heart lurched, and she reached down to help her up. But Sophie shook her head fiercely, pushing herself back to her feet. "I can do it." Her voice trembled, but her eyes blazed. She pulled harder, grunting with the effort, until the wagon jerked forward again. Eleanor walked closer now, one hand steadying Sophie's shoulder. "You don't always have to be strong alone, child." "Yes, I do," Sophie panted. "Daddy's gone. You're all I have. If I don't do this, nobody will." The words hit Eleanor like a blade. She pressed her lips together, hiding the quiver in her chin. Sophie was 6 years old, yet speaking with the weariness of someone twice her age. The girl had lost her father, her mother, the ease of childhood. And still, here she was, carrying what most grown men couldn't. A gust of wind swept across the road, bringing with it the smell of wet earth and distant smoke. Eleanor shivered. She could feel her chest tightening, the warning she often ignored. She slipped a pill from her pocket, dry swallowed, and kept walking. Sophie couldn't see her weakness. Not now. They passed the old Miller farm, its fields gone to weeds, the mailbox rusted through. Sophie glanced at it, then back to the road. "Grandma?" "Yes, baby?" "Do you think people will help us? Or will they say it's just a dog?" Eleanor hesitated. The town was divided these days, half its people hardened by struggle, the other half clinging to scraps of kindness. She didn't know which they would meet tonight, but she couldn't crush Sophie's fragile hope. "Some will help," she said softly, "and that will be enough." Sophie nodded, though her small jaw tightened as if bracing for disappointment. The shepherd stirred again, his ears twitching against the sound of her voice. Eleanor leaned close, whispering to him without thinking. "Stay with us, boy. She needs you." The drizzle turned heavier, drops pelting the wagon boards. Sophie slipped again, but she dug in, her bare feet cutting into the gravel. Eleanor moved alongside, steadying the cart when it tilted. Their steps fell into rhythm, child and grandmother, each carrying what the other could not. The road stretched on, endless and unforgiving. Yet within the strain of each step lay something more. Survival. Poverty had pressed them thin. Grief had hollowed them. But love, for a son lost, for a child left behind, for a wounded animal who had chosen trust, drove them forward. And in that moment, Eleanor understood something she hadn't before. This impossible journey was not just about saving the shepherd, it was about saving themselves, about proving that even in the dust and ruin, they still had the strength to fight for life. The wagon creaked, the rope cut deeper into Sophie's palms, and Eleanor's chest ached. But they did not stop. Not while there was still breath in the dog, not while there was still love in the girl, not while the road stretched ahead. The rain had slowed to a mist, turning the dusty road into patches of slick mud. Sophie's small frame strained against the rope, her breath shallow, the wagon's wheels crunching and groaning with each reluctant turn. Eleanor walked beside her, one hand pressed against her chest, the other steadying the wounded shepherd. The dog's amber eyes flickered open from time to time, each glance a fragile reminder that he was still with them. The sound of an engine broke the silence, a low rumble rising over the drizzle. Eleanor stiffened, her eyes narrowing as headlights cut through the haze. A battered green pickup truck slowed to a crawl beside them, tires hissing on wet gravel. Caleb Moore. Eleanor recognized him instantly. The man's face was all hard lines now, etched with years of bitterness and grief. His farm bordered theirs on the western edge, though he kept to himself these days. The divorce, the whispers in town, the accident with his boy, it had all carved the softness out of him. At 48, Caleb looked older, as if grief had aged him twice over. The truck stopped, and the driver's door swung open. Caleb stepped out, boots sinking into the mud. He scanned the scene, the girl pulling the wagon, the old woman beside her, the battered dog sprawled across planks of wood. His eyes darkened. What in God's name? His voice was low, rough like gravel. "Rosie Carter, what are you doing dragging that beast down the road?" Sophie glanced up, her pigtails plastered to her cheeks with rain. "He's hurt. We're taking him to Dr. Rhodes." Caleb's eyes snapped to the dog, recognition and rage flickering across his face. "That's a shepherd." The word came out like a curse. Eleanor bristled. "He's a dog in need, Caleb. That's all that matters." "That all that matters?" His voice rose, brittle with pain. "You know what a shepherd did to my boy? To Matthew?" His fists clenched at his sides. 47 stitches. My son bled in my arms, Rosie. That dog should be put down before it kills someone else's child. The words struck the air like a hammer, and Sophie froze. For a heartbeat, Eleanor feared her granddaughter would crumple beneath their weight. But Sophie turned, her face streaked with tears and mud, eyes blazing with something fiercer than fear. "He's not like that," she said firmly. Caleb's jaw tightened. "They're all like that. Shepherds are bred to fight, bred to hurt. You can't trust them. Not after what I've seen." Sophie stepped between him and the wagon, her arms spread wide, as though her small body could shield the wounded animal from Caleb's words. "He's scared," she said, her voice trembling but unbroken. "Just like me." The road went quiet. Even the drizzle seemed to hush. Caleb blinked, caught off guard. "What?" "When Daddy died," Sophie said, her voice rising with each word, "I was scared all the time. I had bad dreams. I didn't want to talk. But that didn't make me bad." She looked back at the shepherd, then up at Caleb with heartbreaking simplicity. "He's scared too. That doesn't mean he deserves to die." The man faltered, his anger colliding with her innocence. His eyes flicked to Eleanor, as if searching for help, but Eleanor only held his gaze. Her face was weary, but her voice steady. "She's right, Caleb. Hurt doesn't always mean dangerous." Caleb's throat worked as he swallowed hard. He glanced at the shepherd, whose amber eyes stared back, steady and unflinching. Despite his pain, there was no growl, no bared teeth, only quiet endurance. Eli's voice broke the silence. "Daddy?" Eleanor started, realizing for the first time that Caleb's surviving son sat in the truck, peering out the open passenger window. Eli looked smaller than she remembered, his face pale, his eyes shadowed with a fear that hadn't left him since that day a shepherd had attacked. "Get back in the truck, Eli," Caleb muttered. But Eli didn't move. His gaze was locked on the dog. "He doesn't look mean." Caleb's face twisted with conflict. "You don't know what you're saying, boy." Sophie seized the moment. "Come see," she urged gently. "He won't hurt you. He just needs someone to believe in him." Eli hesitated, torn between fear and curiosity. Caleb raised a hand as if to stop him, but then let it fall, his shoulders sagging beneath invisible weight. For a long moment, the only sounds were the patter of rain and the faint rasp of the shepherd's breath. Then Caleb turned away sharply, his voice low, almost hoarse. "You'll regret this, Rosie. Mark my words. Some things can't be fixed." He climbed back into the truck, slamming the door harder than necessary. The engine growled to life, tires spitting mud as the truck pulled forward. But Eleanor noticed his speed had slowed. He didn't leave them entirely behind. He lingered in the distance, headlights glowing faintly through the drizzle, as though some part of him wasn't ready to abandon them. Sophie exhaled shakily, her shoulders trembling. She reached down, placing her small hand against the shepherd's head. "See? He didn't hurt anybody. He's good." The dog's tail twitched faintly, and Eleanor felt her chest ache. Sophie's childlike wisdom had cut through years of bitterness in a way no adult argument ever could. She reached out, brushing wet strands of hair from her granddaughter's forehead. "You've got more courage than the rest of this town combined," Eleanor whispered. Sophie looked up at her, eyes wide and glistening. "No, Grandma. I just know what it feels like to be hurt, and I don't want him to feel alone." Eleanor swallowed hard. The road stretched endlessly ahead, but somehow, with Sophie's hand resting steady on the shepherd's head, it felt a little less impossible. The drizzle thickened into a steady rain, flattening the dust of the road into patches of slick mud. Sophie still gripped the rope across her small shoulders, though her steps had slowed. Eleanor walked close beside her, her hand resting lightly on the shepherd's heaving side, as though her touch alone could keep him tethered to life. Behind them, Caleb's truck rolled at a crawl, headlights glowing faintly in the mist. He hadn't left them completely, though his face when he looked their way was hard and closed off. The past clung to him like rust, unforgiving, unyielding. But in the cab of the truck, Eli Moore pressed his face to the glass, his wide eyes locked on the battered dog sprawled across the wagon. 9 years old, thin for his age, the boy looked as though fear had carved hollows beneath his skin. The memory of the shepherd that had attacked him lived still in the jagged scar near his jaw, in the way his shoulders hunched as if bracing for another blow. The truck lurched to a stop again. Caleb stepped out, muttering something under his breath. But it wasn't him. Eleanor noticed this time. It was Eli. The boy's small hands gripped the edge of the open window before he slid out of the cab, boots splashing into the mud. He didn't ask permission. He simply began walking, one slow step at a time, toward the wagon. "Eli!" Caleb barked, his voice sharp with fear disguised as anger. "Get back here!" But Eli didn't turn. Sophie froze where she stood, rope slack in her hands. Her eyes lit with something fragile but powerful. Hope. She said nothing, only waited, giving Eli the space to choose for himself. Eleanor's heart ached as she watched. She had seen this boy before, running the fence lines, chasing fireflies with Daniel's laughter ringing in the summer air. That was before the bite, before the nightmares, before he had retreated into silence. Now he approached as if walking into a storm. The shepherd, though weak and bleeding, lifted his head slightly, his amber eyes locking on Eli. There was no growl, no warning, only a steady gaze, patient, almost gentle. Rain slicked his fur into dark clumps, and his chest rose unevenly, but his eyes remained fixed on the boy. Eli stopped just short of the wagon. His hand hovered uncertainly in the air, trembling. The memory of teeth, of pain, was still written across his face. Caleb's boots splashed closer, his voice tight. "Eli, don't you dare! That dog's dangerous!" But Eli whispered so softly, Eleanor almost missed it. "He doesn't look dangerous." The rain fell harder, drumming against the wagon boards. Sophie leaned forward, her voice a whisper of encouragement. "It's okay, Eli. He won't hurt you. He knows." The boy glanced at her, then back at the dog. His hand still trembled, inches from the shepherd's fur. His breathing quickened, shoulders tense. Then, with a small, shuddering breath, he reached forward and let his fingers brush the thick, rain-dampened coat. The shepherd didn't move, didn't flinch. Instead, his tail gave a faint, weak thump against the wood. His eyes closed briefly, and he exhaled a sound that was almost relief. Eli gasped softly, his hand jerking back. But then he placed it down again, firmer this time, fingers threading into the coarse fur. The dog accepted it, his massive frame still, his amber eyes opening just enough to look at the boy with something that might have been gratitude. The world seemed to pause. The rain softened. The road hushed. Eleanor felt her throat tighten, tears pricking her eyes. She looked at Caleb, standing frozen a few steps behind his son. For the first time, the man's mask cracked. He looked less like the bitter neighbor, and more like a father caught between fear and awe. His hands, clenched into fists moments ago, now hung limp at his sides. "Daddy," Eli whispered, not taking his hand from the dog's fur. "He's not mean. He's just hurt." The words pierced deeper than any sermon, any lecture. Caleb's jaw worked, but no sound came. He looked at his boy, pale and trembling, yet brave enough to touch what had haunted him for a year. He looked at the shepherd, too weak to stand, but strong enough to accept trust instead of fear. And something in him shifted. Sophie, still holding the rope, whispered with the certainty only children possessed, "See, Grandma, he knows who's good." Eleanor nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving Caleb. "Yes, baby, he does." Caleb turned away, rubbing a hand across his face, rain mingling with something wetter on his cheeks. He muttered something about the storm, about getting moving, but Eleanor saw it. The first crack in the wall he had built around his heart. The seed had been planted, not by argument, not by reason, but by the trembling hand of a child who dared to believe in goodness again. The wagon creaked as Sophie pulled forward once more, her thin frame bent beneath the strain. Eli walked beside her now, his hand still brushing the shepherd's fur, as if anchoring both himself and the wounded animal. Caleb followed, silent, his headlights casting long shadows down the road, and for the first time in a long time, Eleanor dared to believe that hearts, like broken bones, could be set to heal. By the time Eleanor, Sophie, and the battered shepherd reached the outskirts of Red Willow, the town already knew. News in a place like this traveled faster than any telephone line or radio broadcast. One set of eyes on the road, one whispered retelling at Henderson's general store, and suddenly, every kitchen table carried the story. Rosie Carter and her granddaughter dragging a half-dead German shepherd through the rain. The reaction split the town clean down the middle. At the corner near May Henderson's store, a cluster of townsfolk gathered as the wagon creaked past. May herself, apron still dusted with flour, rushed forward with a blanket in her arms. "Lord have mercy," she whispered, spreading it gently across the dog's body. "He's burning up." Her hands shook, but her voice was steady. "Don't you worry, Rosie. We'll get him help." Others murmured agreement, stepping forward with small offerings. Old Frank Murdoch, who never had a kind word for anyone, thrust a jug of clean water into Sophie's hands. "Dog looks half-starved," he muttered, embarrassed by his own compassion. "Needs it more than I do." But not everyone was moved. From the stoop of the hardware store, Jim Clearwater crossed his arms, his voice cutting sharp through the rain. "You're out of your minds," he said flatly. "Dragging a dangerous animal into town. What happens when it turns on that child, or on one of ours?" A murmur of unease rippled through the crowd. Some nodded, reluctant but swayed. Others looked away, ashamed to agree, but too burdened by their own hardships to argue. "He's not dangerous." Sophie's small voice broke through, fierce despite her exhaustion. She stood before the wagon, arms spread wide as though shielding the shepherd from suspicion. "He's just hurt. He needs us." The sight of her, mud-caked dress torn, rope burns angry against her palms, eyes shining with raw determination, silenced some of the muttering. Yet Jim's scowl deepened. "That dog'll cost this town more than he's worth. Folks can barely feed their own families. You really want to waste medicine, money, and time on a stray?" Eleanor bristled, her back straightening despite the ache in her bones. "He's not a stray," she said firmly. "He's a life. And in this town, we used to believe every life mattered." The words cut deep. Some shifted uncomfortably, remembering old days when neighbors showed up for one another without question, barn raisings, harvests, nights when a single lamp burning meant someone needed help. But times had hardened them. Farms had failed. Banks had taken homes. Compassion felt like a luxury few could afford. "Rosie, don't you see?" Jim pressed, his voice hard. "This isn't about kindness. It's about survival. That animal's nothing but a burden." It was May Henderson who stepped forward then, planting herself between Jim and the wagon. Her voice rang clear despite her years. "You call it a burden. I call it a test. If we can't come together for something helpless, then what do we have left worth saving?" The argument hung heavy in the damp air. Some nodded in quiet agreement. Others muttered about wasted effort. A few drifted away, unwilling to pick sides, but too uneasy to stay. Through it all, Sophie knelt beside the shepherd, whispering softly, her small hand resting on his massive head. He didn't stir much, but his ears flicked faintly, as though he heard every word. Eleanor stood behind her, heart pounding, watching the faces around them. Division was carving Red Willow apart. Fear on one side, compassion on the other. And in the center of it all, lying broken but unyielding, was the shepherd. A symbol of the choice they all had to make. Would Red Willow harden further, letting bitterness dictate their path? Or would they remember the strength that came from unity, from carrying one another's burdens no matter how heavy? The answer wasn't clear yet. But as the storm clouds deepened overhead and Sophie's fragile voice rose again, "Please, he's my friend." Eleanor knew the decision would define more than the fate of one dog. It would define the soul of the town itself. The bell above Henderson's general store door gave a faint, weary clang as Eleanor pushed it open. The scent of flour, kerosene, and dried beans lingered in the air. But tonight the place felt less like a store and more like a sanctuary. The townsfolk, drawn by whispers of the Carter girls' rescue, crowded into the narrow aisles, their faces pale in the flicker of oil lamps. Sophie stumbled in first, rope still slung across her bruised shoulders, dragging the wagon that bore the half-dead shepherd. Mud dripped from the wheels, streaking May Henderson's spotless floor. Nobody complained. All eyes fixed on the dog, the great heap of fur and blood, his body sprawled across the planks, each shallow breath rattling like a failing bellows. "Here, child," May said softly, sweeping aside a row of feed sacks to make space. She knelt, spreading thick quilts on the floor. "Lay him down here." Together, Eleanor and Sophie eased the shepherd onto the blankets. His body was heavier than Eleanor had expected, solid even in weakness. He whimpered once as they shifted him, then went still, his head dropping heavily onto the quilt. A hush settled over the room. "Doctor." Amelia Rhodes pushed through the crowd, her dark hair pulled back, her coat half-buttoned from being called so suddenly. She dropped to her knees beside the dog, stethoscope already in hand. Her movements were brisk, practiced, but when she looked into those amber eyes, even she faltered. "Mercy," Amelia whispered, sliding her hands over the battered flank. "What on earth have you been through?" The onlookers pressed closer, their breathing shallow, as if afraid that even the sound of their lungs might disturb the fragile life before them. Sophie crouched near the shepherd's head, refusing to leave his side. She stroked his ears, whispering softly, "It's okay, boy. You're safe now." Amelia lifted his paw, frowning at the deep rope scars etched into the skin, the calluses thick around his pads. She brushed aside fur at his shoulder, revealing old healed wounds, long white scars that spoke of violence, not accident. "This isn't some farm stray," she said quietly, glancing up at Eleanor. "He's trained. Look here." She pressed along the dog's flank, then pointed at a faint tattoo inked inside the ear, nearly hidden under fur. "That's a canine mark." Gasps rippled through the store. "A police dog?" May whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. "Not just any dog," Amelia murmured. Her eyes roamed over the body, noting the muscular frame beneath the grime, the discipline evident even in exhaustion. "Look at the way he doesn't thrash, doesn't bite. He's holding himself still so I can work. That's training. Years of it." Sophie's eyes widened. She leaned down, pressing her forehead against his. "See, Grandma, I told you. He's special." Eleanor swallowed hard, heart pounding. She had suspected something in those eyes, that steady, almost human gaze. Now, hearing it confirmed, she felt both awe and dread. If this truly was a canine, then whose partner had he been? How had he ended up broken and abandoned in a rusted trap by the creek? Amelia worked quickly, cleaning the infected leg with gauze soaked in iodine. The smell was sharp, bitter, and the shepherd whimpered low, but he didn't move. He bore the pain with the kind of restraint only animals who had served knew. The townsfolk watched in silence, as if attending a vigil. Some looked unsettled by the scars, by the evidence of battles fought and survived. Others seemed transfixed, reverence softening their faces. "He's seen war," muttered old Frank Murdoch, his gruff voice tinged with something like respect, or something near enough to it. Sophie lifted her head, her voice clear, unshaken. "Then he deserves peace now." The child's simple words cut through the room, leaving grown men staring at their boots. Amelia finished dressing the leg, her brow furrowed with worry. "He's weak," dangerously dehydrated. But the way he's holding on. She shook her head in disbelief. Most dogs would have given up hours ago. He hasn't, Sophie whispered fiercely, because he knows we won't give up on him. The shepherd shifted then, his heavy head pressing into Sophie's small lap. The crowd let out a collective breath they hadn't realized they were holding. And in that quiet moment, rain pattering against the windows, the lamps casting long shadows over shelves of beans and flour, the people of Red Willow faced the truth together. This wasn't just a wounded dog. This was a survivor, a fighter, and maybe, just maybe, a reminder of what they could still be if they chose compassion over fear. The store was still, save for the soft drip of rain from Sophie's braids onto the quilt and the muted clink of Dr. Amelia's instruments as she worked. Valor lay motionless, except for the faint rise and fall of his chest, his bandaged legs stretched out before him. Every person in Henderson's general store seemed to hold their breath, as though the entire town's fate now hinged on this one dog's survival. The bell above the door rang once more, and in stepped Pastor Jonathan Wells. He carried the storm with him, rain dripping from his coat, his hair plastered flat against his head. At 68, his frame was stooped, his hands gnarled by years of holding both hymnals and shovels at gravesides. Yet his presence seemed to steady the room. Conversations hushed. Even the lamps flickered more softly in his wake. "Evening," he said quietly, though his eyes were already fixed on the dog stretched across the quilt. He moved slowly through the crowd, his boots leaving small puddles on the wooden floor. Sophie looked up as he drew near, her little hand still resting on Valor's muzzle. "Pastor Wells," she whispered. "He's going to be okay, right?" The old man crouched carefully beside her, his knees protesting as he lowered himself. His gaze swept over the shepherd, taking in the scars, the tattoos in the ear, the faint signs of training etched into every muscle. Then his eyes widened, and for a moment he looked 20 years younger. Shocked, unmoored. "Good Lord," he breathed. His hand trembled as he reached out, not quite touching the dog but hovering just above his battered fur. "I know this one." The words rippled through the store. Eleanor stiffened where she stood, her heart pounding. "What do you mean, Jonathan?" The pastor swallowed hard, his voice thick. "This isn't just any dog. This was Daniel's partner." Silence crashed over the room. Every head turned toward him. Every pair of eyes flicked from the pastor to Eleanor, then to Sophie, whose mouth fell open in stunned disbelief. "My daddy's—" Sophie's voice broke, trembling between hope and confusion. Pastor Wells nodded slowly, his eyes misting. "Yes, child. This was your father's K9. I remember him from the day Daniel brought him home to meet the congregation, proud as I'd ever seen him. Said this shepherd saved his life more than once." Eleanor's knees nearly gave way. She grasped the edge of a shelf for support, her fingers digging into the wood. Memories tumbled forward, Daniel in his crisp uniform, kneeling proudly beside his dog, his smile bright enough to light a room. He had spoken of retirement, of bringing the shepherd to the farm, so Sophie could grow up with him. That dream had died with Daniel's patrol car 3 years ago. And yet, here he was. Sophie pressed both hands into Valor's fur now, her voice shaking. "Daddy sent him back to us." Valor stirred faintly, his ears twitching as though he recognized the word. He opened his amber eyes, fixing them on the child with a quiet intensity that silenced every doubt. The crowd erupted in hushed whispers. Daniel Carter's dog? All this time, how did he survive? Dr. Amelia leaned back on her heels, shock etched across her face. "That explains the training scars, the discipline, He isn't just a survivor. He's a soldier. Pastor Wells bowed his head, whispering almost to himself. A soldier who found his way home. Eleanor finally lowered herself onto a nearby stool, her hands shaking in her lap, the truth pressed against her chest, stealing her breath. For years she had prayed for a sign that Daniel still watched over them. Now, seeing Sophie with her small hands buried in the fur of the very dog he had trusted most, she felt those prayers answered in a way both devastating and beautiful. Tears streamed freely down Sophie's cheeks, but her smile shone through. "See, Grandma? I told you he was special. Daddy wanted us to find him." No one dared argue. Even Jim Clearwater, who had stood earlier railing against wasted effort, found himself staring at the dog with something like shame softening his face. May Henderson crossed herself quietly. "Lord works in mysterious ways." Eleanor could only nod, her throat too tight for words. She reached out, letting her weathered fingers brush against Valor's fur, just above Sophie's hand. "You came back," she whispered, her voice cracking. "All this time, you came back." The shepherd's tail gave a faint, weary thump. The sound was soft, but in the quiet of that store, it was thunder. And in that moment, Red Willow was no longer divided. It wasn't about whether to help a stray dog or not. It was about honoring a fallen officer, a son, a father, and the partner who had carried his memory back to the family he loved. The emotional core of the story revealed itself, raw and undeniable. This wasn't just about saving a dog. It was about saving Daniel Carter's last gift. The store had grown so quiet that the rain outside seemed to echo through the rafters. Sophie pressed herself against Valor, her fingers buried in his fur, as if anchoring to the truth Pastor Wells had just spoken. The shepherd wasn't a stranger. He was Daniel Carter's partner, her father's dog. Pastor Wells adjusted his glasses, eyes clouded by memory. "I remember the day Daniel brought him to church," he said softly. "Folks gasped when they saw that shepherd, strong as stone, sharp-eyed. But Daniel told us it wasn't strength that mattered. It was loyalty. He said this dog had already saved his life twice, once from a knife fight, once from a gunman. He swore that if anything happened to him, he trusted this dog more than any man to protect those he loved." Sophie's breath caught. "He really said that?" "Yes, child," Wells nodded. "Your daddy wanted you to grow up with him at your side, to learn loyalty from the best teacher he knew." Eleanor's heart cracked. She remembered Daniel leaning in the doorway, grinning as he said Valor would retire on their farm. She had teased him, but admired his conviction. Now, years later, here that dream was, bloodied but alive. Sophie whispered fiercely, "Buddy's not a stray. He's family. Daddy sent him back." Valor stirred, his tail brushing faintly against the quilt, as if confirming her words. Dr. Amelia Rhodes, still kneeling by the dog, looked at Eleanor. "If that's true, then he's carried Daniel's legacy all this time. Maybe that's why he fought to survive. He was finding his way home." Tears burned Eleanor's eyes. She had prayed for a sign that Daniel wasn't lost entirely. Now, here it was, flesh and blood with amber eyes. The room hushed, reverent. May Henderson dabbed at her cheeks. Jim Clearwater, who had doubted most loudly, fell silent. Sophie's certainty filled the space like light. Valor wasn't a dog who needed saving. He was Daniel Carter's partner, and now family. Yet Amelia's sharp eyes lingered on the dog's collar, too heavy, too deliberate. She found a hidden seam, cut carefully, and pulled free a small folded cloth. The room held its breath. Unfolded, it revealed a torn scrap of deep navy, stiff with blood, its edge still bearing a stitched police insignia. Daniel's uniform. Silence fell like stone. Sophie gasped. "That's Daddy's." Eleanor swayed, gripping the counter to keep upright. She remembered the officer's words. No remains recovered. She had forced herself to believe them, but this, the scrap Valor had carried, told another story. "Daniel," Wells whispered a prayer. "What were you trying to tell us?" Whispers rose. "Why would the dog have that? Wasn't it an accident?" Jim Clearwater muttered, "Maybe someone didn't want us to know the truth." "Don't you dare!" Eleanor snapped, though even she felt the weight of it. If Daniel's last act had been to send his partner home with proof, then Red Willow's tragedy was more than it seemed. Amelia folded the cloth carefully. This wasn't a chance. Someone sewed it here. It's proof, and a message. Sophie's small voice pierced the tension. "Daddy wanted us to find it. That's why Buddy came back, to bring us Daddy's secret." The shepherd gave a faint sigh, tail brushing once. To Sophie, it wasn't conspiracy. It was love, proof that her father had thought of her until the end. Eleanor pressed trembling fingers to her lips. This was the last tangible piece of her son, not returned by officers or officials, but by the loyal companion who refused to leave. She whispered, "Daniel, you sent him home." The town felt the ground shift beneath their feet. Daniel Carter's death wasn't the clean accident they'd been told. There was more. Truth, danger, unanswered questions. But Sophie, her cheek pressed to Valor's head, knew only this. He's Daddy's last promise. That night, Red Willow fell quiet again. Valor lay wrapped in quilts under Amelia's watchful care. Eleanor coaxed Sophie home, though the girl resisted. "He needs me," she whispered, clutching Valor's paw. Only Pastor Wells' promise that the shepherd wouldn't be left alone persuaded her. Back at the farmhouse, the air was heavy. On the kitchen table lay the folded scrap of uniform, hidden in a box. Sophie slept at last, her hand curled around a photograph of Daniel with Valor at his side. Her dream carried her to a meadow bathed in golden light. Daniel stood there in his flannel shirt, smiling exactly as the photograph showed. Beside him sat Valor, whole and gleaming. "Daddy!" Sophie cried, running into his arms. He lifted her, laughing softly. "You're so big now, and so brave." "I found him," she said. "I found Buddy. He came back." Daniel's gaze softened. He rested a hand on the shepherd's head. "I knew he would. He was always the best at finding home." Then, kneeling to her height, his voice grew quiet. "He's yours now, Sophie. I trained him to protect, but his greatest lesson was love. He'll guard you the way he guarded me." Tears welled. "But why can't you come back too?" Daniel brushed her hair gently. "Because some journeys don't lead back, but love finds another way. That's why I sent him. So you'd never be alone." The shepherd pressed his head against her chest. She felt the strong thump of his heart, the same rhythm that anchored her in waking life. Daniel's voice faded like a hymn. "When you see him, Sophie, you'll see me. When he stands guard, it's my promise keeping watch." The meadow blurred. Sophie reached out desperately. "Don't go," he smiled one last time. "I never left. Remember that." Then he was gone. Only Valor's warmth remained. Sophie woke at dawn, her pillow damp with tears, but her lips curved in a quiet smile. She whispered into the silence, "Daddy sent him back." Eleanor, weary from her own restless night, paused at the doorway. She saw faith shining in her granddaughter's face, a faith untouched by suspicion or doubt. For Eleanor, the cloth raised questions of conspiracy. But for Sophie, the dream settled everything. Valor wasn't just a dog in need. He was Daniel's legacy, a living promise that love endures. And as the town stirred awake, Sophie knew with certainty she and Valor belonged together. The evening in Red Willow had settled into a fragile calm. Inside Henderson's general store, Valor lay under the soft glow of kerosene lamps, his chest rising with steadier breaths, now that fluids coursed through his veins. Sophie curled against him, whispering promises into his fur. Neighbors lingered in quiet vigil, their divisions soothed by the revelation that this was Daniel Carter's partner, the dog who had come home. Then came the sound. First faint, an unfamiliar wail slicing through the countryside night. Then louder, closer. Sirens, tires on gravel, doors slamming. The calm shattered. Sophie bolted upright, clutching Valor's head. Eleanor's stomach dropped. The door burst open. Deputy Sheriff Mike Patterson stepped in, rain clinging to his uniform. Behind him came Officer Janet Walsh of Animal Control, clipboard under her arm, posture rigid. Her eyes swept the room before locking on the shepherd stretched across the quilt. "Step back," Patterson ordered. "We've had reports of a dangerous dog attack involving a minor." The words detonated like dynamite. "Dangerous?" Sophie cried. She threw herself across Valor, arms spread wide. "He didn't hurt anybody." Eleanor stepped forward, her voice sharp with fear. "Mike, you know us. Do we look like people hiding a dangerous animal?" "All I know is the report," Patterson replied. "Large shepherd, aggressive, child endangered. We can't ignore it." Walsh snapped open a catchpole, the metal glinting under the lamps. Valor's ears pressed back, a low whine escaping his throat. "He's sick, not savage." Dr. Amelia Rhodes rose from her crouch, gloves still stained. "I've treated him for hours, no aggression, not once." Walsh's tone was clipped. "Protocol requires quarantine, rabies evaluation, behavioral assessment. Until then, this animal poses a potential threat." Pastor Wells stepped forward, trembling but firm. "That child risked her life for him. He's her father's last gift to this town, and you call him a threat." The townsfolk bristled, their earlier divisions forgotten. Even Jim Clearwater, once the loudest critic, stood grim-faced, unable to stomach Sophie shielding Valor from a steel noose. "Look at him, Janet," Eleanor said, her voice cracking. "Does that look like a monster, or a soldier who's already given everything?" Walsh didn't bend. "Remove the child, now." The crowd erupted. "No!" cried May Henderson. "You'll have to go through us," thundered Pastor Wells. Even the town's cynic growled, "Touch that dog, and you'll regret it." For the first time in years, Red Willow stood united. Sophie pressed her cheek against Valor's chest, whispering fiercely, "I won't let them take you. Not ever." The standoff hung heavy. Valor lay too weak to rise, amber eyes tracking the noose Walsh held. "Step away, little girl," Walsh said. But Sophie didn't move. Her torn princess dress spread like a shield, her hands tangled in Valor's fur. "He's mine." The townsfolk shifted uneasily, their silence an unspoken wall. Patterson swallowed hard, caught between duty and compassion. Walsh advanced. Valor whimpered, fear, not fury, in his voice. "See? He's unstable," Walsh snapped. "It's scary," Amelia shot back. "He hasn't bitten once, not even through agony. That's not aggression, it's trust." Sophie screamed, clutching tighter. Daddy sent him back to me." Her words pierced the room, shaking even hardened men to their core. Then, a small voice said, "Wait." From the back stepped Eli Moore, Caleb's surviving son. Pale, trembling, but resolute, he walked towards Sophie and the dog. "Son, don't," Caleb whispered hoarsely. But Eli kept moving, his 9-year-old frame carrying the weight of memory. His brother's death by a shepherd's bite, the fear carved into his family. Yet here he was, crossing the floor toward another shepherd. He crouched a few feet away, knees shaking. "Can I?" he asked Sophie. Through tears, she nodded. "He won't hurt you. He's gentle." Eli extended his hand, fingers trembling as they brushed Valor's fur. The shepherd froze, then lifted his eyes, steady and weary, as if to say, "I know your fear. I will not add to it." Gasps echoed as Valor exhaled, shuddering, and closed his eyes. His tail thumped once, weak but undeniable. Eli stroked more firmly now, his voice breaking but proud. "If he was dangerous, he wouldn't let me do this." Caleb's face crumpled, undone by the sight of his son touching grace itself. Sophie's face lit with triumph. See, he just needed someone to believe in him. For the first time, Walsh faltered. Her grip on the pole slackened, her mask cracking. Patterson spoke softly. "Maybe this isn't what the report said." At last, Walsh lowered the pole. The room exhaled. Sophie buried her face in Valor's fur, whispering, "I told you they wouldn't take you." But Eleanor's eyes were sharp. Somebody made that call. Somebody told dispatch there was a dangerous dog. Who lied? The question dropped like a stone. Faces turned, shuffling, coughing. It was Jim Clearwater who broke. He stood stiff-backed, jaw clenched. "It was me." Gasps rippled. "You?" May Henderson whispered. Jim kept his eyes on the floor. "After I left, I thought about liability. About what happens if he snaps. If this whole town pays the price. I thought I was protecting us." "Protecting us?" Eleanor's voice shook with fury. "That animal dragged himself through hell to find his way home, and you tried to have him killed." "I was scared," Jim muttered. His shoulders sagged. "Fear makes a man foolish." Sophie lifted her head, her small voice steady, older than her years. "I'm scared all the time. When Daddy didn't come home, when Grandma cries at night. But I don't hurt people." The store went silent, but for the creak of the lantern in the draft. Eli spoke quietly. "He's not like the dog that hurt my brother. He's different. I can feel it. Sophie's right." Jim's breath rattled, undone by children's honesty. Pastor Wells added gently, "There's a difference between caution and cowardice. You let fear lead, but it's not too late to make it right." Jim finally looked up, meeting Sophie's gaze. Her disappointment stung worse than fury. "I'll make it right," he whispered. No one praised him, but the promise hung in the air, fragile as dawn. Sophie laid her cheek against Valor's head, whispering so only he could hear, "Don't worry, buddy. He won't hurt you anymore." Valor's tail brushed faintly against the quilt, a weak but undeniable sign. And Red Willow understood. Tonight, it wasn't just the shepherd on trial. It was all of them. The store had just begun to breathe again after the storm of accusations. Jim Clearwater's confession still lingered like smoke, but Sophie's arms around Valor steadied the room, and Eli's trembling touch reminded them that compassion could triumph over fear. For one fleeting moment, Red Willow seemed whole again, Then Valor convulsed. It began with a twitch in his flank. Then his chest seized, breath faltering in jagged spasms. Sophie's cry pierced the air. "Buddy?" She pressed her hands against his ribs, desperate for the rise and fall to return. "Doctor." Amelia dropped to her knees, stethoscope clattering. She checked his chest, pulse, gums, her face paling with every second. His heart rate spiking. Too fast. Too erratic. The townsfolk held their breath. Sophie clung tighter, whispering, "Stay with me. Please stay." Amelia adjusted the IV, worked with shaking hands, then finally drew back, her voice low but devastating. "If we don't get him into surgery, he won't make it through the night." The room gasped. Eleanor staggered, clutching her chest. "Surgery?" "In Lincoln," Amelia said. "There's no other facility within 100 miles. He needs imaging, blood work, possibly debridement. If the infection spreads, or his heart gives out, it's over." The words pressed down on them all. Sophie's eyes brimmed with terror. "But Lincoln's so far. He can't make it." Amelia's silence was answered enough. The crowd shifted helplessly. Farmers who had endured drought, women who had buried children. None had an answer. And at the back, Jim Clearwater bowed his head, knowing his false report had stolen precious time. May Henderson's voice cracked. "How much would something like this cost?" "Thousands," Amelia admitted. "But money's the least problem. Transport could kill him before we ever reach the city." Helplessness filled the room like smoke. Eleanor touched Sophie's shoulder. "Honey, we may have done all we can." "No!" Sophie's cry tore through the store. "You said Thompson women don't give up. You said that." She pressed her face to Valor's fur, whispering fiercely, "He's not allowed to die. Daddy sent him. He's supposed to take care of me." The child's sobs, the ragged rasp of the shepherd's breathing. Together they bound every heart. Amelia rested a hand gently on Sophie's shoulder. "Sweetheart, he's fighting. Harder than most ever would. But love alone isn't enough. He needs more than I can give here." The truth was unbearable. Yet Sophie lifted her tear-streaked face, eyes blazing. "Then we'll find a way. We have to." Her defiance cracked the despair. Pastor Wells' voice trembled. "Maybe that's why Valor came back. To remind us, when one of us is down, all of us must carry." A murmur of awakening rose. Spines straightened. Valor groaned softly, pressing his muzzle against Sophie's lap as if to say, "Don't give up." Marcus Wheeler stepped forward then, pulling truck keys from his pocket. "I've got the biggest rig in town. Extended bed. Heavy suspension. If anyone's hauling him to Lincoln, it should be me." The offer silenced the room. Marcus, who had cursed shepherds for years, was now volunteering. But Amelia shook her head. "Marcus, moving him could kill him before we leave Red Willow. His blood pressure is unstable, his rhythm erratic. Every bump, every turn. It could trigger collapse." Marcus bristled. "You just said he'll die if we do nothing." "That's true," she admitted, her voice tightening. "But transport without oxygen, monitors, pain control. He may not survive the lift, let alone the drive." Eleanor's voice cracked. "So we let him die here?" "I'm saying the risk is nearly as high as doing nothing," Amelia replied. "He's a soldier's dog. He's fought longer than most could. But one wrong jolt could end it." Sophie's head jerked up. "We have to try. Daddy never gave up. Valor won't either." Her defiance shook them all. Marcus crouched beside her, rough hand on the quilt. "Sometimes even brave men lose," he said softly. "No," Sophie whispered. "Daddy said Valor would take care of me. He can't if he's gone." The rawness in her words pierced him. Marcus looked into the shepherd's amber eyes, clouded with pain yet steady. Something stirred inside him, something he hadn't felt in years: belief. "I'll drive carefully," he promised. "I'll dodge every pothole. Keep him steady. If he's got a chance, it'll be with me." Amelia's jaw tightened. "If he dies on that truck, it'll be in my hands, on yours." Pastor Wells spoke gently. "Doctor, sometimes the only wrong choice is not to choose at all." Amelia closed her eyes, then finally nodded. "Fine. But we do it my way. IV secured, fluids steady, blankets strapped. And Marcus, if you hit one pothole, I'll drag you from that seat myself." A ripple of laughter broke the tension, fragile but alive. Marcus gave a nod. "Understood." The crowd surged into motion. Blankets, boards, ropes, anything to steady him. May Henderson pushed sandwiches into Sophie's hands. Caleb stood with Eli, pride flickering despite his grief. And Valor stirred faintly, tail brushing the quilt, as though he understood. Preparations filled the store, yet Valor's breathing grew shallower, each exhale weaker. Time was bleeding away. Then a child's voice cut through. "Why don't we call the helicopter?" The bustle froze. Eli Moore stood near the counter, twisting his sweatshirt hem. "The police helicopter. The one that flew Mr. Jenkins to the hospital last spring. If it can carry a person, it can carry a dog." Silence followed. A few chuckles, sad, dismissive. Frank Murdoch muttered, "Son, medevacs for humans. They won't scramble for a dog." But Eli didn't back down. "He's not just a dog. He's a police officer too." The words struck like lightning. Sophie's tear-streaked face lit with sudden fire. "Yes, Daddy said Valor wasn't just a dog. He wore a badge. He's a hero." Pastor Wells gripped his cane, remembering Daniel introducing Valor as his partner. "Not my dog, my partner." Amelia froze, calculating. Technically, Canine officers are sworn members of the force. Their records are filed. Valor was registered under Daniel's unit. It's possible that emergency services could treat him as an officer down. A stunned murmur swept the crowd. "That's ridiculous," Frank muttered, though weakly. "It's not ridiculous," Sophie snapped. She stood, small fists clenched, her voice trembling, but fierce. "Heroes deserve help, even if they walk on 4 legs." Her words cracked something in the room. These were people who had buried soldiers, carried flags at funerals. They knew honor. Caleb lowered his head. "If Daniel Carter's partner still breathes, maybe it's not for us to decide what he deserves." Marcus set his keys on the counter, slow and deliberate. "If there's a chance, they'll send that bird. It's the only road worth trying." Jim Clearwater rubbed his face, shame etched deep. "My brother-in-law works regional services, owes me a favor." His voice shook. "Maybe it's time I try to fix what I broke." The store erupted in hushed conversation, half disbelief, half hope. For the first time, the impossible didn't feel impossible. Sophie dropped back to her knees, wrapping her arms around Valor's neck. "Hear that, buddy? They're going to send a helicopter. Because you're not just mine. Your daddy's partner. Your family. And family never gets left behind. Valor's tail gave the faintest thump, a sound so small it could have been missed, yet everyone heard it, and in that fragile gesture, hope took root. A child's solution, born of faith, destined to change everything. The store smelled of antiseptic and damp quilts, but beneath it ran something sharper, the metallic tang of fear. Valor's chest rose in ragged rhythm, each breath a countdown none could stop. Amelia's hands moved with desperate precision, but time was slipping. The idea of a helicopter still hung in the air, half hope, half dream. Sophie clung to it fiercely, whispering to Valor, as though her belief alone could summon rotors. Eli hovered nearby, his courage surprising even his father. The rest of Red Willow waited in tense silence, afraid to believe. Jim Clearwater stood hunched near the shelves, shame wrapped around him like a second skin. His fear had nearly doomed them all. Now redemption flickered before him. Slowly he pulled out his battered phone. "I'll do it," he said, his voice cutting through the store. Heads turned. "My brother-in-law works at a regional dispatch. If anyone can get that bird in the air, it's him." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "And you think he'll listen to you?" Jim's jaw tightened. "He owes me." His thumb hovered over the cracked screen. "But I'll have to frame it carefully." "Carefully?" Amelia demanded. "If I say it's just a sick dog, they'll laugh. But if I say it's an officer down, that's a lie," Amelia snapped. "Not entirely," Jim said grimly. "Valor served with Daniel Carter. K-9s are sworn officers. His service doesn't end because his partner's gone." Silence pressed in. Pastor Wells finally spoke. "Sometimes the letter of the law blinds us to its spirit. If this is the only way to honor the truth, then do it." Sophie's small voice followed, trembling but sure. "Please, Mr. Clearwater. For Daddy." For Valor. Jim swallowed, squared his shoulders, and pressed call. The ring stretched like a rope, ready to snap. Then a gruff voice answered. "Clearwater, it's late." "We've got an officer down," Jim said. A pause. "What kind of officer?" "K-9, Valor, partner of Daniel Carter. He's critical. Needs emergency transport to Lincoln." "I thought Carter was killed years back." "He was," Jim said. "But his partner wasn't. He's here. And if you don't get him out tonight, he won't see the sunrise." The dispatcher hesitated. "You know protocol. Those birds don't fly for animals." "Not unless it's an officer," Jim pressed. "And I'm telling you, this one still counts. Are you going to let a police officer die because of red tape?" Silence. Then a weary sigh. "You're playing me hard, Clearwater. I'm telling the truth. This is life or death." The line crackled, then, "All right. 20 minutes out. Keep him stable." Jim lowered the phone, his chest heaving. For a moment, no one moved. Then Sophie whispered, "You did it." Tears stung his eyes. He nodded. "Helicopter's on its way." Relief surged through the store. Neighbors embraced. Eleanor sagged against the counter. Amelia bent to prepare Valor for transport. Sophie pressed her cheek to his head. "See, buddy, you're not alone. They're coming." The sound came first, a faint thrum, like a heartbeat on the horizon. It grew until the windows rattled and jars shook on the shelves. Outside, Red Willow gathered under the bruised indigo sky, lanterns and headlights casting circles of light. Valor lay on a stretcher, chest rising unevenly, amber eyes fluttering open and shut. Sophie never let go of him, whispering, "You'll come back. You'll see the farm. Just hold on. The helicopter descended into the field, rotor wash flattening corn stalks. To Sophie's eyes, it looked like magic, roaring and powerful. Tonight, it carried her last hope. 2 paramedics leapt out, practiced and briskly. "Where's our patient?" "Here," Amelia said. "K9 officer, severe infection, cardiac instability. Stabilized as best we could." Surprise flickered in their eyes, but training left no room for hesitation. They assessed quickly, nodding at Amelia's rapid report. The townsfolk closed in behind them like an honor guard. Marcus helped lift the stretcher, Caleb steadying Eli at his side. Even Jim moved silently to hold the IV bag, his penance plain. And Sophie, her torn dress whipping in the rotor wash, walked beside Valor like a knight's squire. Her eyes never left him. At the helicopter, Amelia bent to Sophie. "You can say goodbye." Sophie pressed her forehead to Valor's. "You're not alone," she whispered. "Daddy's waiting, and I'll be here when you come home. You promised." Valor's tail twitched once. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Then Sophie pulled a faded photograph from her pocket. Daniel in uniform, smiling beside a younger Valor. She handed it to Amelia. "Please, give this to the doctors, so they know he has a family." Amelia's throat tightened. She slid it into her bag. "I promise, sweetheart." The crew loaded Valor into the helicopter. Eleanor nearly collapsed, Pastor Wells catching her arm. The crowd stepped back as the blades roared. Sophie clutched Eleanor's hand, eyes locked on the cabin lights. "Grandma," she whispered, "what if he doesn't come back?" Eleanor kissed her hair, her own tears spilling. "Then we remember. He fought with everything he had. But Sophie, I believe he will, because your daddy sent him, and because love doesn't quit. Not in this family." The door closed. The helicopter lifted, beating the night into submission as it rose into the Nebraska sky. The town stood rooted, watching the blinking red lights fade into the horizon. Silence followed, a silence that felt like prayer. No one went home. They lingered outside Henderson's store, lanterns glowing like candles in a vigil. Chairs were set out in rows, coffee poured into paper cups. Eleanor sat heavy in her seat, Sophie curled against her lap, whispering to the stars. "Please watch him, Daddy. Please help him be strong." Daniel's face rose in Eleanor's memory, the boy who had begged for a shepherd puppy, the man who had said, "When I'm with him, I know I'm never alone." Tears slid down her cheeks. Pastor Wells settled beside her. "Sometimes," he said softly, "the waiting is the hardest battle." Neighbors gathered close. Marcus passed coffee. Caleb held Eli with pride. Even Jim stood apart, eyes fixed on the sky, as though willing the helicopter back. Hours dragged, lanterns dimmed, yet no one left. At midnight, Wells prayed aloud, simple and raw. "Lord, have mercy on one of your creatures. Give strength to a town that's forgotten hope. And give this child what she deserves, a companion to remind her she is never alone." Sophie didn't bow her head. Her eyes stayed fixed on the stars. "Daddy, if you can hear me, don't let him go yet. I still need him." A shooting star streaked briefly across the heavens. Sophie gasped, clutching Eleanor's hand. "See? Daddy heard." Eleanor's tears spilled freely then, not from despair, but from the strange, aching beauty of belief. And so Red Willow waited in the dark, old farmers and children, widows and skeptics, bound together by the fragile thread of a shepherd's heartbeat, waiting not just for news of a dog, but for proof that love, once given, never truly dies. The Carter farmhouse felt heavier than it ever had. For 3 endless days, its rooms echoed not with laughter, but with the hollow sound of waiting. The telephone on the kitchen wall became the most important object in the house, silent, looming, ready to deliver either life or loss. Eleanor moved like a ghost, folding laundry that didn't need folding, carrying teacups she never drank from. Each creak of the floorboards sent her gaze snapping toward the phone, but it stayed quiet. Sophie fought the silence with faith. She turned the kitchen table into Buddy's homecoming corner, her father's photo in uniform, a drawing of Valor wearing a crown, a mason jar of wildflowers she replaced each morning. Every night she whispered promises, showing Valor the oak tree, the barn kittens, the quilt she and Grandma had sewn. "Dogs don't break promises," she said once, small hands folded in prayer, "so I won't either." But even her hope frayed as days dragged on. Her pigtails drooped, her eyes shadowed. She still whispered to the stars, but softer now, as if afraid to be wrong. On the 3rd morning, grey light pressed the world flat. Eleanor sat at the kitchen table, the foreclosure notice hidden beneath the fruit bowl. Sophie perched beside her, clutching Valor's photograph like it could hold her heart together. Then the phone rang. The sound jolted them both upright. Eleanor's teacup spilled across the table. Sophie's chest heaved with sudden hope. Eleanor's hand trembled as she lifted the receiver, Sophie's small fingers steadying her. "Hello?" Dr. Amelia Rhodes's tired but steady voice answered. "Mrs. Carter, I've been waiting for this call as much as you." He made it. The surgery was a success. The infection's under control. When I walked in this morning, he wagged his tail. Eleanor sank into her chair, tears spilling unchecked. Beside her, Sophie gasped and spun in her nightgown, joy exploding from her small body. "I knew it. I told you he was too strong to give up." "He's not out of the woods," Amelia cautioned gently. "There will be weeks of recovery, but he fought hard, and he's still fighting." Sophie pressed her face to Eleanor's arm. "He wagged his tail, Grandma." "That means he remembers us." Eleanor closed her eyes. Against all odds, Daniel's partner had come back to them. "Thank you, Amelia," she whispered. "It wasn't just me," Amelia said softly. "It was him. And maybe it was the love waiting for him here." When the call ended, Eleanor set the receiver down with trembling hands. Sophie climbed into her lap, both of them weeping, not from sorrow, but from the overwhelming release of hope realized. "See, Grandma," Sophie whispered. "Daddy sent him back. Heroes don't give up." Eleanor kissed her hair, and for the first time in years, the house felt alive. Outside, the grey sky broke, sunlight striking the old oak tree where Daniel had carved his initials long ago. And somewhere in Lincoln, a battered shepherd stirred on his blanket as though he, too, felt the love waiting across the miles. The next morning, the phone rang again. Eleanor's heart hammered as she lifted it. "Hello?" Amelia's voice came steady but weighted. "Valor made it through the night. He's resting now. But there's something else, something we found." Eleanor gripped the phone tighter. Sophie leaned close, wide-eyed. "When we shaved around his collar," Amelia explained, "we noticed thick stitching. Inside the lining, we found a waterproof packet, a note, in Daniel's hand, addressed to you both." Eleanor's knees nearly buckled. She could see him in her mind, hunched over a desk, writing in the dim light before a mission, always preparing, always planning for what he never wanted to say aloud. "Please," Eleanor whispered. "Read it." Paper rustled across the line. Then Amelia's voice, reverent, spoke Daniel Carter's words from beyond the grave. "Mom, Sophie, if you're reading this, it means I didn't make it back. But if Valor found you, then my last prayer was answered. I trained him not just as my partner, but as my family's protector. If I fall, Valor is my gift to you. He'll guard Sophie with his life and remind you my love hasn't ended. It just lives on through him." Eleanor pressed her hand to her mouth, sobs breaking free. Sophie clutched her arm, eyes wide as if seeing her father in the words. Amelia continued, "Sophie, my little star, I carried your baby blanket in my patrol car since the day you were born. Valor knows you're sent. He'll find you no matter what. Trust him the way I did. He's not just a dog. He's family." Sophie's tears spilled, but her face glowed. Daddy knew. He knew Valor would come. "There's more," Amelia said gently. The letter went on. "Mom, I don't want Sophie to grow up with only grief. I left something else, a treasure, hidden where the earth holds our roots, under the oak tree we planted together. Tell Sophie the words. Valor, find the treasure. He'll know. It isn't gold. It's what I saved for her. College money, letters, pieces of myself I couldn't leave unsaid. Sophie deserves a life where she can dream without fear. Valor will show her the way. Take care of each other. Love never dies. It just changes form. Forever yours, Daniel." When Amelia's voice faded, Eleanor wept openly. Sophie wrapped tight in her arms. "He really did send Valor," Sophie whispered. "Daddy made sure." "Yes, baby," Eleanor said, kissing her hair. "He made sure." On the other end, Amelia's voice softened. "When Valor is strong enough, he'll be ready to lead you there." That evening, the note lay on the kitchen table, glowing under lamplight like a relic. Sophie traced its edges with reverent fingers. "Grandma," she whispered, "Daddy knew I'd need him." "Yes, sweetheart," Eleanor said, covering her hand. "He knew." The clock ticked loud in the stillness. Sophie's voice broke it again, steady and wise. "Valor isn't just a dog. He's Daddy's way of being here. Daddy gave him to us, so we wouldn't be alone." The child's words shattered Eleanor's defenses. For years, she had carried grief like an anchor. Now, through Sophie's faith and Daniel's words, it began to shift. Less absence, more presence. Memories flooded her. Daniel grinning in his academy uniform, introducing Valor as family. She laughed then. Now she understood. Sophie climbed onto her lap, clutching the letter. "When Valor comes home, can we read this to him? So he knows Daddy's words too?" Eleanor kissed her hair. "Yes, darling. We'll read it to him. He'll know he carries your father's love." Outside, the oak tree stood silhouetted against the night sky. Roots holding secrets, branches holding the stars. And far away in Lincoln, Valor stirred in his sleep, ears twitching as though he had heard. Eleanor looked down at Sophie, already asleep against her shoulder, and whispered into the quiet, "Daniel, you kept your promise, and I'll keep mine. With Valor by our side, we'll never be alone again." For the first time since her son's death, grief no longer felt like a hollow chair at the table. It felt like a bridge, leading her and Sophie toward the love he had left behind. The morning sun spilled over Red Willow like a blessing, gilding the frost-tipped fields in gold. For days the town had waited for news of a miracle, and now, at last, it arrived, rattling in Marcus Wheeler's old truck. In the flatbed, cushioned with quilts and hay, Valor lay stretched out, bandaged, scarred, but alive. His tail beat faintly, as if he already knew he was nearing home. By the time the truck turned onto Main Street, the crowd was waiting. Farmers in overalls, children clutching mothers' skirts, elders leaning on canes, all pressed forward. When Marcus braked in front of Henderson's general store, silence fell. Then Sophie broke free, her little figure a streak of pink and gold. Valor. The shepherd's ears pricked. His head lifted, amber eyes locking on her. With a throaty whine, he struggled to rise. Muscles trembled, but sheer will carried him upright. He staggered toward the edge of the flatbed, tail thumping harder. Sophie scrambled up before anyone could stop her. She buried her face in his fur, arms wrapped around his neck. "You came back. I knew you would." Valor pressed his muzzle against her cheek, licking away her tears. His body sagged, but his pride shone through every scar. Around them, the crowd exhaled as one, some clapping, others simply weeping. At the truck's edge, Eleanor steadied herself on her cane. She had promised she would not break. But seeing Sophie cling to Daniel's partner, seeing the shepherd answer with such devotion, her knees weakened. Tears carved lines down her face. Pastor Wells touched her shoulder. "He's home, Eleanor." Daniel kept his promise. From the crowd, Eli Moore stepped forward. He had been silent through the waiting, watching from the edges. Now, as Valor's amber eyes found him, the last of his fear ebbed. Trembling, he reached out. The shepherd leaned into his palm, warm breath filling the space between them. "He remembers me," Eli whispered. Marcus, watching, felt something long buried crack. He stepped closer, voice low. "I was wrong." Eleanor met his eyes. "No, Marcus. You were hurt. There's a difference." For the first time in years, his shoulders sagged with relief. Applause swelled, hats lifted, voices called Valor's name. To the town, this wasn't just a dog returning. It was proof that love endured. Sophie pressed her forehead to Valor's. "You're not just mine. You're Daddy's gift. Your family." The shepherd's tail beat a rhythm like a heartbeat. Eleanor climbed into the flatbed, laying her hand on his back. The warmth beneath her palm was more than body heat. It was legacy. She looked out at the crowd, her voice steady despite tears. "This is Daniel Carter's partner. He carried my son through battles, and now he's come back to carry us. He's not just a survivor, he's a hero." The cheer that rose blurred in Eleanor's ears. All she saw was her son's eyes in Valor's gaze. All she heard was Daniel's voice whispering from memory. "Take care of them, boy." As dusk fell, Sophie tugged Valor's leash. "Come on, boy. Daddy left us something. You know where." The crowd, sensing the ceremony, followed in a hushed procession to the Carter farmhouse. Their boots crunched on gravel, breaths fogging in the cool air. Marcus walked with Eli at his side, their eyes fixed on the shepherd limping but unbroken. Behind the house, the oak tree loomed. It had stood for generations, initials carved deep into its bark. The last light of day bled through its branches. Sophie knelt beside Valor, laid her hands on his fur, and whispered the words from her father's letter. "Valor, find the treasure." The shepherd's ears twitched. His head lifted, eyes sharpening with sudden alertness. He lowered his nose to the earth, sniffed, then pawed at the ground with determination. The crowd held its breath as dirt flew, slow and steady, each scrape driven more by memory than muscle. Sophie dropped to her knees, scooping earth with her bare hands. Eleanor stood back, one hand clutching Daniel's letter to her chest. At last, Vala's paw struck something solid. With a soft whine, he scraped again until the rusted edge of a metal container emerged. Gasps rippled. Together, Sophie and Eleanor dragged the box free. Its lid was sealed with tar, scarred with rust. Eleanor's hands shook as she pried it open. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were bundles of bills, Daniel's savings. Photographs spilled out. Daniel in uniform, Daniel cradling newborn Sophie, Daniel kneeling in full canine gear with Vala at his side. At the bottom lay a small wooden box. Eleanor opened it to find her mother's engagement ring carefully tucked away and a stack of letters in Daniel's familiar hand. Sophie lifted one photograph into the fading light. Her father crouched beside Vala, both smiling, strong. On the back, Daniel had written, "So she'll know her protector." Tears streamed down her face. "Grandma, he thought of everything. He never forgot us." Eleanor pulled her close, whispering through sobs. "He made sure you'd never grow up without knowing his love." Behind them, Pastor Wells removed his hat, voice reverent. "This isn't just money. This is a father's heart, preserved in soil and memory." Marcus Wheeler stepped closer, his own son Eli at his side. He looked at the photos, at the ring, at the mementos of sacrifice and foresight. His voice was hushed, but honest. "I thought I'd lost faith in this town, in people. But this shows me I was wrong. Love like this, it's stronger than bitterness, stronger than fear." Eli tugged his father's sleeve, his eyes fixed on Vala, who now lay at Sophie's feet, exhausted but content, his tail thumping against the earth. "He really did bring it back, Dad. He brought back everything." Sophie, her cheeks streaked with dirt and tears, turned toward the shepherd. She cupped his muzzle in her small hands and whispered, "Thank you, Vala. Daddy's treasure wasn't just the money. It was you. It was always you." The shepherd's eyes softened, his great head bowing, as though he understood. The townsfolk stood in a silent circle beneath the oak, watching as generations of loss, love, and legacy converged in a single moment. The past had not been erased, but it had been redeemed, unearthed by the bond between a little girl, her grandmother, and a dog who had carried a fallen hero's last wish home. As the sun slipped below the horizon, casting the oak in silhouette, Eleanor closed the box gently and held it to her chest. Around her, the townsfolk began to hum soft words of blessing, their voices weaving together into something like a hymn, and Sophie, leaning into Vala's fur, whispered once more, "Daddy, we found it. We found everything you left for us." The wind stirred the oak's branches, whispering through the leaves like a father's approval. The Nebraska sky burned with the colors of farewell, fiery streaks of crimson melting into rose, fading at last into violet. The Carter farmhouse stood in silhouette against the glow, its weathered boards bathed in the same light that had once fallen on generations before. The air was cool, touched with the smell of tilled earth and wood smoke. And on the wide front porch, a chapter of sorrow quietly closed while another began. Vala lay stretched across the worn planks, his body finally at rest. His bandaged leg, though still stiff, no longer twitched with pain, but pulsed with the steady rhythm of healing. His great chest rose and fell in calm waves. Beside him, Sophie sat cross-legged, one hand tangled in his fur, her cheek pressed to his shoulder. Her princess dress, now patched and faded beyond recognition, fluttered lightly in the breeze, but she wore it with the same quiet pride, as though it had carried her through battle. Eleanor rocked slowly in her chair nearby, the old wood creaking with each motion. Her eyes wandered across the horizon, where the last of the sun dipped beneath the cornfields, but her mind stayed fixed on the scene before her. For years she had known loss, the weight of it pressing her heart into silence. Tonight, for the first time, that silence broke, not with grief, but with peace. Neighbors had gathered earlier, bringing casseroles, blankets, toys for Valor, even flowers for Sophie. They had left as twilight deepened, leaving the farm hushed and holy in its solitude. Yet their presence lingered, a reminder that Red Willow had rediscovered its strength, not through money or politics, but through compassion. Sophie stirred, lifting her head to study Valor's amber eyes. They glowed faintly in the dim light, not wild or haunted now, but steady, patient, and protective. She touched his muzzle gently. "You don't have to be sad anymore," she whispered. "You're home. Daddy made sure of it." Valor answered not with sound, but with movement. His tail thumping once, slow and deliberate, before he shifted closer, pressing his weight against her small frame. Eleanor closed her eyes. Daniel's letter, heavy in her lap. "If I fall, Valor is my gift to you." The words had seared into her like scripture, reshaping her grief into something bearable. Her son had not abandoned them. He had planned, prayed, prepared. And this animal, this brave, scarred shepherd, was the bridge between what they had lost and what they had been given. The porch lights flicked on, casting a soft halo around them. Sophie leaned back, gazing at the stars beginning to prick through the indigo sky. "Grandma," she asked softly, "do you think Daddy can see us right now?" Eleanor reached across the space, taking her granddaughter's free hand. "Yes, sweetheart. I think he's been watching all along, and I think he's smiling, seeing us together like this." Sophie considered that, her child's wisdom deepened by loss. "Then he knows Valor did his job. He brought us back together." The words struck Eleanor's heart with quiet truth. She looked at her granddaughter, at the shepherd resting like a sentinel at her side, and she saw it clearly. This was not just survival, this was restoration. The farm itself seemed to sigh with relief. The oak tree stood tall beyond the house, its roots now guarding Daniel's treasure, its branches swaying in the evening breeze as if waving approval. In its shadow, the land felt less like a burden of debts and foreclosures, and more like a home again. Sophie began to hum softly, the kind of tuneless song children invent without thinking. Valor's ears flicked, and he let out a low, contented groan, his body sinking deeper into rest. For the first time in months, Eleanor felt no fear about the night ahead. The farm might still face hard days, her body might still ache with age, but they were no longer alone. The three of them, child, grandmother, and shepherd, sat together as the last rays of the sun bled into night. In that moment, they were bound not by blood alone, but by sacrifice, memory, and the enduring truth that love is not diminished by death. It changes form, it carries forward, it finds new ways to protect and guide. Eleanor reached out, brushing Sophie's hair back from her face. "He'll watch over you now," she murmured. Sophie smiled faintly, her eyes heavy with sleep. "I know. Daddy's here, in Valor, in us." As darkness settled fully, Eleanor leaned back in her chair, her heart at last unclenched. The farm was quiet, the stars endless, and on the porch lay proof of a promise fulfilled. A German shepherd whose loyalty had outlasted tragedy, a little girl who refused to give up, and a family that had been broken, but not destroyed. Hope had returned to Red Willow. And as the night deepened, Valor lifted his head one last time, scanning the horizon, watchful and at peace. Then he lowered it onto his paws, content in the knowledge that his mission was not over, but simply changed. Here, in this house, with these people, he was home. At the end of this story, what stays with us isn't just the trials or the tears. It's the reminder that love can travel across generations, across silence, even across loss. German shepherds, with their loyalty and courage, seem to carry something almost sacred in their hearts. They don't just guard our homes, they guard our memories, our hopes, and the soft places inside us that need protecting most. If you have a dog of your own, you already know that connection. The quiet look, the steady presence, the way they seem to understand without words. And if you'd like to explore ways to deepen that bond, there are some wonderful resources out there that can help. I came across one that felt more like a friend's advice than a manual, and I thought I'd share it. It's there if you're curious, no pressure at all. In the end, what matters most is this. We're never really alone, not when we open our hearts to the companions who walk beside us on four legs.